All right, I think I'm ready. Put the transcription on. We're recording, and yeah, this is going to be air handling in Rails. So this is a new lesson because so we've heard from employers, and so I've seen on a lot of projects, there's a decent amount of confusion about like what to do about errors. And that is to be expected because we don't really have a formal lesson on it. So wanted to add this so that we could like go through some strategies. And the way that today will work is there'll be kind of like some high level explanation discussion happening for probably the first 30 minutes. And then the next probably 45 minutes, I've got kind of like a code along that I'll have you all do in small groups or probably just pairs, maybe one small group. And it's kind of like go through the lesson plan and code along, ask me questions, and then basically hopefully there's like enough time to run through that once. We'll see. If not, that's okay. I'll kind of like answer some questions about what we've done and then show an alternative approach that is not like currently outlined in the lesson plan, but that'll just be kind of like me live coding a different approach. Okay. Cool. So yeah, I wanted to just use some vocabulary here that we're gonna be kind of, I mean, it's not necessarily new to y'all, but it's like the vocabulary that I want y'all to focus on today. And yeah, we're gonna use some built-in Ruby methods called raise and rescue from to hopefully handle errors with grace. We're going to take an object-oriented approach to error handling, right? And spoiler alert, I guess, we're going to take an object-oriented approach in like the code along portion that I've done for y'all, but then we're going to take a better approach after that. Yeah, that's all I'll say. So first we need to like kind of think about what is an exception, what is an error. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to read through these definitions. Okay, they're pretty similar and they're like not quite the same, but I think when we look at the class hierarchy, it might make sense as to like why there's a differentiation between this idea of exception and errors. And for the point of today's class, we're just going to focus on what these mean in Ruby because there's obviously these terms exist outside of Ruby, but for the context of today, we'll kind of like stay within Ruby. Cool. So yeah, I'm going to put y'all in some breakout rooms. And really, I just want you all to be like thinking about the errors that you've been getting, right? We've taken a TDD approach to just about everything. And even if you're not necessarily following TDD strictly, you're still seeing errors in the browser that are going to be similar to the errors that you see when you're TDDing. So I want you to like think about, as you've been developing these applications, like all the errors that you can think of that you've seen that you're knowledgeable about, and then what you've done so far. Like what have you done to, get around these errors when you encounter them? And that can be like any approach. I'm going to put us in some small groups. Make sure that I have, yeah, this looks good. All right. And so what I'd like for y'all to do is have like one person drive and like take notes, and that person should be the person with the darkest colored shirt on. And then everyone else kind of like brainstorm with them and take about 5 minutes on each. All right. Opening now.
It's for sure probably going to show up in other controllers.
Cool. I appreciate you using some solid technical language there. Yeah, so all of the other controllers are inheriting from application controller in the context of that application. So if we put the rescue there, then it has the ability to rescue from an exception at any of the child levels of the hierarchy within our controllers. So any of the controllers that inherit from application record. Okay, cool. Appreciate that. Other approaches that y'all have taken so far. Let's hear from Andrew. What did you all talk about?
Well, let's see. We, talked about, just a bunch of errors. I suppose at the very end, someone kind of said, "Oh yeah, there's probably we could also probably include some GitHub, things where it's like, oh, you didn't, save your stage changes. Make sure you stash them or commit them before you leave this branch type of stuff." That one is probably technically an exception, I would guess, rather than an error. But that was, I think, the most interesting thing that it was like, oh yeah, I didn't even think of that, and somebody else suggested it.
Yeah, I'm glad y'all are thinking of those things, because those are some of the more common errors that y'all run into with Git and GitHub. Just like, hey, you can't actually push right now. Sorry. Hey, if you try to check out a new branch, you're going to lose all these changes. Please commit them before you do. So those are common errors to Git and GitHub. And imagine a world where the maintainers of Git did not plan for those errors, right? And you just lost all the changes instead of getting those exceptions when you try to do something that will result in a loss. And instead they just were like, yeah, we're not gonna, tell you about that, and sorry for your luck. So I think that's a great example of, the maintainers of that software planning ahead for the inevitable issues that will arise in the course of using that software. Cool. I want to hear from one more person. I'd love to hear from Claudia. What did you all talk about?
We also talked a lot about the rescue from. We got caught up in talks of like the difference between an exception and an error, because kind of seems like the rescue from method raises like an exception, but it outputs an error. So it's kind of like a big gray area of what it actually is.
Yeah, so rescue from, I'll just kind of give you some backstory on it. It can essentially rescue you from an error or an exception. So it could do both. And essentially, when you're using that method, you're saying, hey, when this exception is raised or this error is raised, then we need to run some other code. So it's basically a way for you to say like, hey, in the course of our, application running, usually when an exception happens, it basically like changes it breaks execution in general. Like that's what happens. You hit this error, breaks execution, whatever is happening, and says, nope, here's the exception. So rescue from basically is a way to circumvent that and say like, hey, if this exception is run, like now you're here at this pointer where you're about to like stop executing the program, do this one more thing, which is like, hey, rescue with some block of code and then exit from there. So that's kind of like the idea of rescue from, is that it gives you like this like catch to handle the exception in a way that you want to handle it rather than the standard way that Ruby would handle it. Cool. Other questions that came up during those discussions? Okay, so I think we're on the right track here, but one thing I want us to do is take a look at this exception tree. So all of the exceptions, errors that happen in Ruby are essentially predefined, right? They're predefined classes that ship with the Ruby library. And so, and also remember, like everything's an object in Ruby. So even these like exceptions are objects, and they're predefined by the Ruby library, and they take advantage of, you know, one of our common pillars of OOP, inheritance. And so when you implement a third-party gem like Rails, you're going to get more than just these errors, but all of them will inherit from some class on this list that ships with Ruby, because Rails at the end of the day is, you know, an abstraction of Ruby. So if we're looking at these, the thing that I want you to take note of is exception is at the top of this tree, right? And you probably are like seeing some of these errors and saying like, oh, yep, I remember that one. I remember that one. So there are some exceptions, some errors that we want to run all of the time. Like no matter what, we want those to happen, because that ensures that our program gives us the ability to like, sometimes we need the program to stop running, right? Like, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of when that's going to happen. So we don't want to rescue from certain exceptions, is essentially what I want you to know. Like, we're not trying to handle every single exception all the time. We're trying to handle specific ones. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, this list seems to have like be nested inside of other things. So like load error is under script error. I'm wondering, what does this indentation reflect? What is the relationship between those?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because if that's not clear, then I want to make sure to call that out explicitly. Each indentation represents a line of inheritance. So you can think no memory error, script error, and signal exception. They're all inheriting directly from the exception class, right? But then load error, not implemented error, and syntax error are inheriting from script error. So each indentation kind of represents this like parent-child hierarchy. Other questions coming up as you look at this?
I'm just a little curious about what fatal is at the bottom.
Yeah, fatal is kind of like its own class. We're not going to get into too much about it, but there's documentation on it if you're like more curious into like what exactly fatal is. Yeah, that's all I'll say on this today. All right, so I kind of already said this as far as this like exception being at the top level. So part of the reason we don't want to ever rescue from exception is because, well, not only we want to be more specific about like which errors happened in our program, so that we can be either giving another developer a better message about what went wrong, or even giving ourselves like a better idea of how to handle a specific type of exception rather than, some catch-all like, hey, we're just gonna, catch every exception in our program and not be specific. But the other thing is, like, there's a lot of errors that we need to happen, right? Like, just in general when we're executing our programs. So this one, signal exception interrupt. So if you rescue this, Control C is not working, basically, to like shut down your server, or I think like maybe like, I don't know, I don't think it'll work with Pry, but basically you can't interrupt the pro. So think of like sometimes like even RSpecs like caught in some weird endless loop, or even you just created an accidentally infinite loop. Now you can't rescue from it. You can't break that loop with Control C. So that's a good example. Yeah, if you don't have the syntax errors running, then something like, hey, I forgot to close this quote, fails silently. And so it's like, I don't even know what the intended, like what's going to happen in that case, but my program's not going to run properly. And then this no memory error, another one. So if like Ruby tries to keep executing when your local machine is, out of RAM, like, I don't know what's going to happen there, but like, I don't want to find out either. Right. Like, I don't know what, I'm not well versed enough in the lower level system stuff to deal with that. And that's part of why Ruby is nice, because this is an abstraction from Ruby, where Ruby's like, hey, if this happens in the course of executing your program, we will take care of it by raising this no memory error. But if you rescue from that, now you've kind of opened a can of worms that gives you or limits the ability of Ruby as a library. Okay, so if we look back up at this tree, just want to make it clear, standard air is going to be the class that is like the highest level that we ever want to start intercepting exceptions from, and that we want to start rescuing from. So anything under standard layer, or I'm sorry, anything that's inheriting from standard air, we could rescue from specifically, to be more specific about how we're handling our errors. Or we could simply rescue from standard air, and that's kind of a catch-all for not just like if a standard error is raised, but everything that inherits from a standard error will then bubble up to this like rescue of standard error, and we can then kind of like catch all. It's a catch-all is kind of what I want to say for everything that inherits from it here. So any of these happen and we have some code to rescue from standard error, then it's going to bubble up and our rescue block will run. Okay, so yeah, questions, go ahead, Joey.
So is like the rationale behind kind of doing the catch-all standard error simply for like a more dynamic user experience, or is there just like more of a issue with trying to do an exception? I think like functionally it would probably be better to be more specific, but is there like a risk in trying to put it at the exception level in some capacity?
Yeah, so we never want to put it at the exception level ever. The highest level we ever want to rescue from is this standard error level. So that is, I just want to be clear about that. Like you can make this decision about like where to rescue from and which errors, like that is going to be specific to your program, like the way that your company probably has a convention around, well, hopefully they have a convention around error handling. But this decision to either have a block of code that's like rescue from standard error with the same, render for 404 or whatever you decide to do, like that is, I don't want to say that that's not a valid approach, because if you just want your program to run no matter what, and you're not worried about giving the users any real feedback about what happened there, then you could take this like catch-all approach, right? Like I don't recommend it. I don't think it's not going to scale very well. But if you're like, you know what, for the sake of the next month of my professional app or next few weeks of my app like running and things like going according to plan, maybe I have a ton of user input coming in that I haven't had the time to handle yet, I'm going to rescue from standard error with like, hey, this didn't work, but my program or my application didn't crash. And like, you can still use other parts of my application, just like whatever you tried to do, like you can't do. So it's not that that approach isn't valid. It's just not going to really, it's probably not going to scale, right? It's just not going to work in the long run. But I'm glad that you asked. And so I would say it's kind of the opposite. Well, it's not the opposite of what you said. It's like you said, this is more dynamic. And I would say like, yes, this covers more use cases. And maybe the way I'm thinking of dynamic is it's a little less dynamic because it's not as specific as maybe we want to be.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay, cool. All right, it's 31. Let's take a quick break and then we'll get into this code snippet here. We'll come back at 36. All right, it's 36, so let's jump back in. So all I want to do is essentially copy and paste this code snippet into a Ruby file that you can create anywhere called exception handling. So I have created it over here in the Congress tracker repo. And so then I'm going to run it. Like this. Cool. And I hit this pry. And I just want to talk about this block just a little bit. So begin is this kind of syntax that you may or may not have seen before. I know we haven't covered it. It's basically the way that you can use rescue within any block of code. So like this like rescue from syntax that we've talked about a little bit is like code that needs to be basically is not running in any block of code, and like that would be like something that you would define at the top of a class. But this rescue block allows you to kind of like put this begin, rescue, end, kind of like similar to a like any like block of code, like an if else statement. You can kind of put this in any specific method, so you can limit the scope of where this rescuing happens. Whereas the rescue from, if you put that at the top of the class, now that's going to like basically catch everything in this class and all classes that that current class inherits from. Okay, so got a couple questions here, and then we'll go through this together. But I'd love for y'all to take a few minutes on your own and just answer these bullet points. And yeah, we'll talk about this at like 42, 43. All right, let's answer some of these questions together. So yeah, let's go with George. George, why do we hit this pry? And what is this E variable that we have here?
Yes, we hit the pry because there's an error that gets triggered, and the E is the error class, which is like what I guess is used to find out what the error is.
Cool. And so how would I find out what E is here?
You could just type in E and it should just show you.
Can y'all not see it with the transcript, like the whole thing? Is the transcript in the way? Just move it. Okay.
Transcript only shows if you like turn it on, so I don't think.
Got it. Okay,
it's
cool.
by default.
I would like to hide that. All right, cool. So let's talk about what E actually is. Anyone have an idea? Cool, go ahead, Aiden.
I think it's just similar to a block variable that's going to hold whatever error we get, I change it around to a couple different things, and it's just like a placeholder for what error you hit.
Great. Love to hear that. It's a placeholder for which error you hit. Harrison, did you have anything to add?
I was gonna say it looks like an object too. Well, I guess everything in Ruby is an object, but it looks like that object format.
Totally. Okay, so we're both on the right track. So E is like this like variable placeholder, similar to like a block variable, right? Just like the syntax is a little different with this begin rescue. But what E is holding at the current moment is a no method error object. All right. And so the no method error object is what is returned at this scope, because that's the error that we hit when we called hello friends on a string. All right, so we called that method, then we hit the rescue, which basically says, hey, if you hit a standard error or anything that inherits from standard error, which in this case, no method error is down the chain somewhere. We're not totally sure where from this current context or from what we can see from here, but no method error gets hit, which bubbles up to standard error, which then says, hey, okay, we're rescuing from standard error and every child that it has. So now we're in this pry block. All right. Questions, confusion about that? All right, so did anyone answer these three that they have thoughts, comments on? What class is E? Well, we can answer that one right now. That one's pretty, we can call class and see that it's no method error. But what about these other two? Which methods look useful on E? How would you even find that out? Which classes does E inherit from? Anyone have ideas there?
You just run e.methods and see what methods we have available to us.
Love it. Okay. So this kind of has a lot, and some of these I'm like pretty used to. I can tell that they're like inherited from other classes. So there's another way that we could see this in like maybe a better display. So if I call, let me just make sure you can see what I'm doing here. If I do LSE, or actually let's do a where am I first to get back to that so we can see where we are. So here I am in this rescue block. And so I have access to E. So if I do an LSE, now I can see like specific methods that are more relevant to the current context, essentially. So any of these look like I should call them. Which method should I call first? What do you think is the most useful? All right, I'm making a decision. I want backtrace. Cool. That looks like it's telling me the scope that I'm in here. Looks like the main Ruby object scope and the line number in the file. Cool, helpful. That would be probably a bit longer if the stack, if we had a different example where the call stack was a bit just had a bit more calls before it. I also think that e.exception looks interesting. Okay, that basically returns the exact same thing. And then let's see e.full message. Cool, that looks like a string. Not exactly what I want, but it looks like it's basically giving me the trace back, the scope, undefined method, and then the actual object that method was called on there, and then the actual error class. So not as nice as I want. I wonder if I can pretty print that. No, doesn't work as well as I wanted. So what about e.message then? All right, that one's a little bit easier to read. So all I wanted you to see is that like this is an object like anything else, and you have a way to kind of like inspect this object just like you would in anything else, to get more information about like what is happening here. Cool. And then the other thing I wanted to show you is we can always go e.class, and on our classes, like once we're at the class level, we can call .ancestors. And now this basically will trace all the way from left to right up the chain of where this class inherits from. All right, so no method error, name error, standard error. All right, and then you can see standard error inherits from exception, and remember, everything's an object in Ruby, so that's why we get back up to our top level of basic object. But this is useful for the inheritance like hierarchy. So we can see that basically we caught an error that is, we'll say, 2 steps away from the error that we were rescuing. So this could be useful if you're like, hey, I want to be more specific, but I'm not sure like how specific I need to be for this specific error. Let me rescue from standard error first, call ancestors, and then I'll probably like have a better idea of where I want to rescue this error in the chain, right? How specific do I need to be? Could I maybe just rescue from name error, or do I need to rescue from no method error? Okay. Just wanted to show y'all that is possible to kind of like get some more information here within the rescue block. Questions that came up from this? Okay. So I'm going to get into the kind of like you do portion of this lesson. It's very like code along style, but I want you all to like go about this and have some practice implementing it. But essentially, let's shift gears and just like, I want to, go to my Congress tracker, basically. I'm on this error handling branch. I think it's in a good place. Don't ever do this. Do as I say, not as I do. I'm not even going to do it because I'm too scared. Yeah, there's a lot of changes here. Okay, I think that this is what I want, but I want to go back in time, basically. So don't worry, I'll give you all a chance to see this. Also, don't ever do this. Git add dot recipe for disaster. Am I right, Jahara?
Hey, now I learned.
Cool. That's all I wanted to hear. Go ahead, Ryan. What's your question?
Just doubling back on the begin, and I'm not sure I follow exactly what that does. Do we need to, for this lesson, do we really need to understand like, well, what a begin end block, like what's going on in there?
It allows you to scope the rescuing to like just within that begin block. So essentially like where if you put a rescue from at the top level of like a class and said, hey, whenever this error happens, we're going to rescue from it with, some method, then the entire class has access to the scope of that rescue and all classes that inherit from it. But if you do this begin block, you could put this begin end in any method. So like you could basically have the begin and the end kind of like wrap whatever functionality is happening in the method. And then the rescuing would only happen like within the scope of that specific method. So you're kind of like limiting the scope of where rescuing is going to happen.
So and from a practical perspective, like in the Rails engine project, it seemed that if we had a rescue from at the top of the class, anytime that we say tried to persist something to the database that failed a validation, then it would want to go into this error handling, but we would intercept it with the rescue from. But it seemed like a lot of times, instead of doing like a user create or event create, what I could do is do a user.new, and then I could say if save. If that was true, then something would be okay, but I could do an else statement. And I guess the thing I'm confused about the block is like how is because there's a rescue directly under the line, the Ruby syntax, it's doing the string, it's hitting the method, and instead of Ruby catching the error, it's still getting down to line 3 and it's seeing that, hey, there's a rescue clause here.
Yeah, so you've got most of that all correct. The difference is that Ruby does still catch the error, but because we have the rescue syntax, it catches the error and now directly points to whatever is within that rescue block. So instead of like exiting the program, which it normally does, and displaying the error, it hits the rescue block instead and runs any of the code that's in the rescue block. So all I have in this rescue block is a pry, so it stopped execution,
Okay.
but it could, if I had 10 more things that I wanted to happen, I could have that happen.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Totally. Yeah, good question. Go ahead, Joey.
Ryan's question made me think of something. So I haven't used the begin rescue too much, but in trying to use it, Rubocop didn't like me using begin for it and was just like drop the begin, and all the code still worked fine, but it was insistent that begin not be used within method blocks.
Yeah.
Is there like, I guess I'm just curious. It makes sense and it like worked if you add it in and remove it, but I was kind of curious, is there like a style guide that says like begin is really not necessary, don't use?
I guess like my answer to that is like whatever your company or like where you're working has decided. I don't have any like strong opinions about like whether to use it or not. Like I think it's kind of nice because of what it's doing, even though you don't need it, like the begin keyword, it's kind of like indicating to the developer like, hey, something bad could happen here. So let's look at this block of code and think like, hey, this is the block that your eyes should be looking at where a common error that we might want to rescue from is possible, right? You don't need it, but like, I think it's a signal to other devs that like, hey, let's pay attention here because this is where something like this common error that we're rescuing from can happen.
That makes sense. Because in all the docs we were looking at, it had begin in it, and then Rubocop was like, nah, that's not required. So I was kind of curious why it was doing that.
Rubocop by like definition as a tool has to take some opinions, right? But like a lot of them are just opinions, and that's why it's customizable. That's why you could like edit Rubocop to have different opinions that you agree with. But yeah. Okay, cool. So I just did a commit there. I'm going to check out the branch that I told y'all we would start on. And so at this point, if I run the server, let's just see where we're at. I think that this is going to take me to the one clarification I wanted to make about the FastJSON API and its opinions and basically not having the ID is a problem. So let's search for a senator that we know exists. Perfect. All right. So I thought I would get this error, and I wanted to just apologize because I think that the lesson plan in customizing JSON didn't account for this. And like, first off, sorry about that, because this is just like not fun when you hit an error you're not like used to seeing. But essentially what this is saying is that within our serializer, I'm sure you all have run into this by now, we like need whatever object we pass to our serializer needs an ID. So if I look at my controller here, I'm passing a member. And if I pry in here, run this again. So if I pry in and I look at what member is, it's a PORO, right? So it doesn't have an ID. FastJSON API just assumes everything you pass to it is going to have an ID, and that says like, nah, I'm not serializing this without it. So it took a hard, fast opinion about objects that are passed to it, which sometimes, you wouldn't run into this problem if this wasn't a PORO, right? Because if it was an active record object that had an ID field, it would just kind of like work by default. But since you run into this because it's a PORO. So like, I can fix this by going to my Senate member and saying like, all right, like you're going to have an ID now that I can access. And I'll just set it to 1, as this is horrible practice, but I just want to get around this error. So I'm hard coding the ID to 1. And the reason I'm kind of like thinking like this is okay is because I'm only going to ever have 1 Senate member based on the functionality that I've implemented that is found, right? I'm searching by last name. I'm only going to get 1. Like in the case that there are, 2 senators with the same last name, I would have to build in different functionality. But for the case of like what I'm trying to do here, I just need an ID that my serializer can access. So I'm going to do that. And the thing to think about here is maybe FastJSON API, because it takes this hard fast opinion and we're passing it a PORO that really an ID doesn't make sense. Maybe FastJSON API is not the correct tool for this specific job. And I just want you to like hear that and know that that's okay if you made that decision. And it's also okay to be mad at me for like not pointing this out sooner. But let's hit this again. So now I think hopefully something else happens. Oh yeah, hit the pry again. Cool, 200, okay. Now the ID works. I'm like serializing the JSON in the way that like the JSON API spec wants it, and things are happy. But like, I just wanted to point it out that my bad. And FastJSON API, it's weird. Like it's deprecated, A, so probably not going to use it for that long. B, hard fast opinion on IDs. C, doesn't take a hard fast opinion on error handling. Like I was looking at it and I was like, well, I put a link in here to what their error handling position is, and it's basically like we don't want to make it opinions about how you handle your errors. So in the context of us handling errors in this code along, we don't use the FastJSON API in the serializer that we make for the errors. So just a heads up there. Okay, cool. So we got that to work. And then let's also just make sure we're at this other same point where if I search for someone that doesn't exist now, if I go back and I search for me, haven't made it yet, and I want to take that pry out real quick. Where is it? Here. Okay. So if I search for me, at this point, we get this undefined method, for nil class, because basically it didn't find a senator, and, that broke at somewhere along the line. So that's basically the whole point of this code along, is to say like, hey, we need to error handle when essentially we search for a last name that doesn't exist. And that's what this like exercise is doing. Like, hey, we have to like build in functionality to our application to where it can still run when I type in, reasonably a senator with like a syntax error or like spell the last name wrong, or someone that just doesn't exist, which is a reasonable thing for us to want this application to do. Okay. So we're there. And now for the next, like, we're going to say 40 minutes. First, let's just take a break and then we'll get into this. So let's come back at 07 and then you'll have some breakout rooms to get started. Any questions about what I'm asking you to do as far as like going into this code along with your breakout room members? Cool. We'll come back at like 40. Well, no, a little bit later. We'll come back at 45. So I have some time to run through this and I don't dip into Meg's lesson, but work in a break if you want it, because I'm not going to take another one when we come back. All right.
Hello, gents.
Hello.
Hello. I was I wrote down that there was supposed to be a branch entitled error handling that we could use.
Nah,
Um,
so that's not yet. That one's going to be pushed up at the end of class. Sorry.
Oh,
So customizing JSON is the one that I want you to start from. And then all of like, it's basically that branch is kind of like set up to work. If you add, and this is the one like key thing, like it's in the lesson plan as the code along, but you're going to have to add that like add ID equals 1 or whatever. You're gonna have to hard code the ID for it not to give you that like fast JSON error.
okay.
Right on.
Um,
Thank you.
First.
Andrew, do you want me to drive?
Sure. If you want to drive. I'm not sure how good of a navigator I'll be.
I'll let you
I've-
get to it.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, looks like everyone's back. So I'd love to hear from a few of you. Basically with this question of like, what do you not like about this approach? Like where are your alarm bells going off of like, are we doing this right? Like, is this feels like maybe cumbersome? Yeah, I just want to hear from y'all. Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought it was a little strange that if you pursue it in this manner, then you would have to like make a error poro for like each like other poro that you have. So like we made it for the member, but if you had like another poro for like, I don't know, president or something, then you would also have to make it for that, I think.
Yeah, I like that you're thinking of like, okay, like, am I gonna have to like repeat myself with like a new poro object for every single type of error that could possibly happen? And I do want to say like, no, we don't want to do that. And like, we wouldn't do that. We would try to make a generic like error handling poro object. And that's like essentially what that's trying to be, where it's like, all right, what do we need? Message, status, code. So then we could just reuse that poro like anywhere we needed it, but like we wouldn't want to create another one. I feel like the way that I named it was kind of weird, where it's like error member, and that's like probably what like led you like, oh geez, is this like a specific thing for every single one of these different types of members? And so yeah, and I intentionally named it kind of shitty to like hopefully like that you would think about that. Cool. All right, Andrew, go ahead.
So the thing that told me that something was going wrong was when we did a search on Sanders and we got Sanders. So everything seemed to be working. Then we did a search on someone who didn't exist, Jack and the Beanstalk. Nobody of that name. And we got Sanders again. And
That's
it seemed
interesting.
the only way to get out of that was to restart the server and then do a search on Jack on the Beanstalk. Okay, yeah, we got the error. Now let's do a search on Sanders. Oh, we got the error. It's like it was remembering the one thing, the first thing we did, and it didn't pay attention to anything else, which is exactly like Ryan, when we were writing this, he said, how does it know when to like basically reset? Is it every time you make a call? Like when does it do it? And apparently we were running into that problem of like it wasn't resetting for some reason. So that's how I know we're doing something wrong.
Totally. So, and yes, like that is a good thing to point out. So that is actually kind of like an Easter egg on memoization, where it's like, all right, like the way that memoization is working in that case is it's actually persisting across requests. And that's like hard to tell. It's hard to tell like when that's going to happen. So this actually even leads into like this next class that we're going to have on caching. And it's like, all right, I'm caching, or like caching is like a similar performance technique to memoization, where it's like, all right, I have this response, I'm gonna cache the data. So I'm not actually going to go make a new response, but like, when do I decide it's invalidated? And in your case, you weren't able to invalidate the memoization. So like, that's what you could do to like check that is like, all right, let's put a pry, like where would you want to put it? You'd want to put it right above where the memoization is happening, like after you've run a request already. And then you could see, like, does this variable have a definition, right? Like, is the class variable defined? If yes, then it's persisting, like the memoization is persisting across requests. If no, then like it's treating this request as like the first request and this method hasn't like memoized anything. So it's an interesting like problem to run into just on memoization there, where it's like, hey, it's keeping this variable defined. Yeah, that's not what we need here. We need it, like we need this value to be reset every time. So in that case, you're like, okay, well, memoization is like not the best technique for this specific method. And sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. It's like more, I mean, it kind of depends on what your limits are, what your boundaries are in terms of how often you can hit this API. Like for this specific one where it's like a search box, I mean, you kind of have to let it hit every single time. Like the search box is filled out with a new value. So yeah, something to think about there. What else did I want to say? Okay, any other like, hey, this feels like a code smell to me. I don't like what's going on here. What if we took the approach where instead of having our controller have an if block, our facade have an if block, and like creating all these if else statements that are, hard to maintain, hard to scale? What if right at the point where we knew something wasn't going according to plan, we raised an exception at that point, and then we handled that exception gracefully the way that we would like to, right? Because then we can essentially not worry about creating a ton of conditionals, and instead just be like, nope, if this, like, we can create one conditional, stop execution, go right to our code block that we expect, like, hey, when we see this exception, let's go straight here and do something about it. All right, so I want to do that and like maybe take a different approach. I think for the sake of time, what I'm going to do is, yeah, with a rescue from in the controller. Yes, Mike, that's where we're going with this. So I'm just going to show a quick example and just like a different way that you could do this. No. Oh yeah, this guy. I actually do want this to be in there. Okay. Cool. So I'm on this error handling branch. Let's open up Atom and just take a look at like this other approach that I'm thinking of. Hide. So if we have this like if statement, it's basically like now we're like limiting this controller to like have to check what class it's getting back. And then it's like, oh, well, then I'll do this error member serialization if not. So let's just imagine that like we don't do this check, right? And it's like only things that we need here are execute the happy path. That's it. That's all we want. We don't want to worry about a sad path here. So if it gets to this block, we know we've got this app member. So, all right, let's open up the facade now and see what we can do there. So here we have our if block checking in this member by last name, and it's like, hey, like if you do this one, or if you have a member that exists within the array, then you know, create this PORO with that member's information. If not, do this error. So let's get rid of this too. Let's say instead of like, I kind of want to keep this line for later, but instead of like responding in this way, maybe I say like, I'll switch the logic a little bit here and say like, yeah. So let's raise an exception. We'll use this raise and we'll say no member found error. And we're going to do that if our array is empty, right? Because if it's empty, that essentially means that this find all happened and there's no one in there. And just for the sake of this, like for now, like let's just not memoize this. Just to make sure that that's not like part of the results. So I'm basically going to say, hey, if I don't find someone, I expect to get this no member found there, right? And I'm going to say like, that's my exception. All right. So I'm kind of going to dream drive this. Obviously I don't have this class. All right. So now, yes. Let's go to Congress tracker. Cool. Let's reload, make sure we're good. All right. So now if I search for Terrell, I expect to get the error, right? No, I don't know about this class, right? Oh, different, something different. Yeah, I've got a lot of other stuff going on in this branch. So let's just think, I gotta do some changes around here, sorry. Yeah, this is probably helpful to have commented in. That's why you don't do git add dot, by the way. I had something in there. I forgot I commented it out. Here we are in a sad state. Okay, I'll go over some of that code also. So we'll see. Let's see how much time we have. 4 minutes, cool, plenty of time. So let's try this again. I hope I get my new exception that I've dream driven. Cool, Congress facade, no member found error. That's what I get, exactly where I think it should be. So let's define it, right? So I could have, there's not like I'm not sure like what the hard fast opinion is on like where to put these like error POROs, but I am sure that since I don't know, I went with errors as my name of my directory. And I'm gonna define this error as, let's bring it back up, see what it's called. Just following all the patterns that we have before. And I'm gonna say no member found error.rb. Cool. And now I might steal it from this other error that I've already defined. So I defined this other one that I'll kind of tell you about, but it's basically a simple PORO. The only big thing is to think about here is if you're defining your own error messages, they need to inherit from standard error. Like you're allowed to define whatever you want. They just got to inherit from standard error. So I want most of this stuff in here, but I want it to be just a little bit different. So I'm going to call this no member found error. And we'll say like no member found with that name. And this will be a 404. And this will be not found. Great. All right, so I've got a class here. And now let's see what we get. So we get what we expect now. So it raised. Now this is different than before. What it said before was like, I don't know, uninitialized constant. Now it's just like, nope, no member found error was raised. So this is like behaving how we would want it to. The difference is now we need to decide like, hey, what do I do when this error gets raised? And that we can define at the controller level. So let's go to application controller. I've got some stuff in here, but essentially it's going to be similar to this, where I'm going to say, hey, let's rescue from the no member found error, and let's rescue with like a specific method that I define. So this will be render member not found. And then I'm going to copy and paste a little of this, render member not found. Things to note about this, exception is implied as the argument. So if you basically like define it as like an exception's coming in here, then what I get here when I pry in is I'll get my exception object, which will be an instance of member not found there. So let's go back. Let's search. Am I pried in? Yeah. And like I said, now I get my no member found there here, like as my exception. And now what I can do is I can serialize it with the same serializer that we had in the lesson plan, where I'm just passing the exception, as long as the methods that are defined on my exception, which are error message, code, and status, are also expected by my error member serializer. Which they are here, okay. It looks like I'm gonna need to call serialize JSON to ensure that this runs properly, but I have all of these methods defined, so they're gonna run right here on whatever I pass in to this serializer. Really what I wanna do here is change the name a little bit. I'd probably just want this to be error serializer instead of error member, because that doesn't make sense at this point. So what do I need to do? I need to call serialize JSON. Oh, it already is there. So I think that this might just work. 200, let's see what I got. Oh, I get my exception that I've defined, and now it's reusable. I can reuse that serializer. I have this specific error message, right? It's a Poro, so it's fine that like I'm defining these kind of like how I want them to run. But this pattern is a little bit better because now I haven't created any if-else logic. I've just said, hey, right when I see that something's wrong, raise my exception, respond accordingly. And now this is a pattern that I can use, and I can utilize inheritance basically at the application controller level, so that this will always run, and any controller that ends up like calling into something else like a facade and getting this error. Okay, I don't have time to talk about this external API error as much as I want to because it's 11:02. I'm already cutting into Meg's class. So go to Meg's class, and I'm gonna I do like a little recording of like the other strategy that I took with this external API error. That's just like a little follow up to this lesson, but I'll keep it 10 minutes or less. Okay, thanks y'all. That's it. See you later.
See you.
Thanks,
Tim,
Tim.
Tim, on that video, could you post like why you made that error as an array? Because it seems to me like you could never have more than one error.
Totally. Yeah. So I made an array just according to the JSON API like specification that we've been like looking at as like our guide, our convention guide. Yeah. So they say it has to be errors at the root level pointing to an array. So then it's just an array of objects. I mean, essentially it could be multiple errors here, but like, yeah, I probably wouldn't design it that way. But you could essentially.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks, y'all. Hey.
We are a hot mess this morning.
I was?
No, I don't know if you've seen like people have thrown stuff